Hi, everybody. Good evening. It's nice to see everybody again. It's been about a month, maybe a little bit more since we've learned together. We're going to be continuing, just really pressing on to the next verses in Tehillim in Psalms chapter 1. So right now we're going to begin with verse 4. And as we go, we're also going to talk about the connection between verse 4 and the previous verses. Can't have it any other way. Now, let's read the verse. Lo chen harashoim, kim kamot asher tidfenu ruach. Not so the wicked. Rather, they are like the chaff that the wind drives away. So just to recap a bit, in verse 3, we were talking about the righteous. We were talking about those who don't take counsel with the wicked. And instead, they study Torah, and they meditate on it day and night, and they practice it. And then we said in verse 3, in detail, what these people would bring about, what would be the fruits of their actions, and what would be the effects of their actions on the world around them. And we said that they'd be like a tree planted by streams of waters that yields its fruits in its season, and whose leaf does not wither, and all that he does shall not prosper. So whatever we're talking about now has to be in juxtaposition of what we said up till now about the righteous. We're about to talk about the wicked. Before that, we're talking about the righteous. And now we say the wicked are different. And specifically, the first two words of verse 4, Lo chen harashoim, the wicked are not so. So what we're doing is immediately we're saying, before we even talk about what it is that is the consequences to the wicked, we're saying they're not like the righteous. They're not like the righteous. They're different. So we have to understand this. We're going to also have to understand the language of chaff. What is the metaphor of calling the wicked chaff that blows in the wind? So we have to identify and define what chaff is and what's the significance of chaff. And even more so, why do we have to add that as it's driven away in the wind? What's the significance of that? So the truth of the matter is that the words lo chen are so important. The wicked are not so. And the reason for that is that a person who really wants to keep the commandments, whatever they are, the 7 Noahide commandments, the laws of Moses to Israel, in order to do that in this world, they have to examine two things in order to stay on the right path. The first thing is what we've discussed up till now. What is the reward of the righteous? What do we get? How can we strengthen ourselves? How can we strengthen ourselves and do the right thing? By looking at what's the positive reward for doing so. So that when we come to a point of conflict, we have that. We can turn to that tool and say, okay, I know it's hard now, it's tough, but there's going to be a reward that in the future for me for doing it. So that's the first thing. And as we learned last time, not only is there a reward in the future, meaning in the world after death, but even now in this world, the righteous have their reward. They have their spiritual and intellectual reward in their relationships with people. All that blossoms and is full of vitality and full of development and life. So that idea a person has to think about. That if a person fails to behave like a righteous person, they lose all those opportunities. And if they make the choice to choose Torah and to study the 7 Noahide laws and to fulfill them in all their details, and if a person is from the children of Israel, if they choose to keep all of the 613 laws that are appropriate for them, then they are going to have and partake and enjoy all the fruits that the verses here say will be for the righteous, both in this world and the next world. And they have to think about that when the times get tough. And they have to realize that the wicked person will not get those things. Because, obviously there's the short-term pleasure, satisfaction, success of the wicked. We all know that. We all know there's the short-term success of people who are dishonest in business, or cheat, or are threaten others and oppress others. There's a short-term gain. So how is it that we succeed in declining that temptation of behaving in that type of a manner? Could even be on a simple level of behaviors, interrelationships with people, ego issues. A person wants to feel that they're better than others around them. Okay, they come in a situation where doing the right thing, they're not going to be the most popular kid on the block. Everybody else is, going to parties and getting drunk and doing all types of things, and they're going to be the nerdy person who isn't doing those things. Or whether it's, it's things at work where everybody's breaking certain rules, not behaving in a ethical manner, or behaving in a lewd manner with their colleagues at work, and they'll be the nerd. They'll be the one not behaving in that way and kind of not being the popular person. So dealing with that takes meditation on what's the positive in the future. And just to take us back for a moment, we said last time that the word v'haya, ka'etz, and he will be like a tree, is talking about the future. Person has to have their mind on the future, on the long term in life. I mean, we all know this as mature adults, but in terms of Torah, in terms of doing what's right, it's even more so. Now, at the same time, the person has to also realize the loss, the empty void. Think about it this way. Let's turn that on its head for a moment, what we were talking about before, about, people being successful in business, buying a lot of homes, owning a lot of real estate, having a huge 401k, things like that, right? A person wants to be the successful one in life. We want to, be at the top of the success scale, right? But where are the wicked going to be at the top of the success scale at the end of the day, after their term of years in this world ends? They're going to be way at the bottom, if anything at all. So that's another way for a person to, get themselves to stay on the right track, is to ask themselves, listen, do you want to be in the carnival? Do you want to be one who gets a guest card from God, or you don't? Do you want an invitation, or do you want to be left out? Nobody wants to be left out. So when the times get difficult and people are facing these type of challenges, it's important to meditate on these things. And the truth of the matter is, let's not wait until we face the challenge. It's something that a person should be meditating on constantly. And I believe that's one of the reasons why King David started Psalms with this particular chapter, because it's so important. It has to be meditated on constantly and all the time. Now, we asked the question, what does we mean by chaff? And what is the metaphor of chaff exactly? So there are various explanations. Obviously, all of them start with the basic premise that chaff is a form of straw. It's something that blows in the wind, as the verse says. It blows around in the wind. The question is, what is the kind of implication of all that? So there's a couple of things. The type of straw we're talking about, say the commentators, is a type of straw that is the straw left over from the hay. So in other words, it's not even the type of straw that can be given to use by cattle or for horses, etc. It's what's left after that already is gathered, so it has no use whatsoever. And the commentaries say so too. A wicked person really brings nothing positive into the world. Everything they bring into the world is negative. It brings only harm into the world. So that's one thing. Other commentaries say that it's not referring to the wicked now in this world, but it's referring to the wicked in terms of their punishment. And the same way that these small, very, very small, almost hairs of hay blow around in the wind and are thrown up against trees, animals, and whatever else there is in a chaotic manner by the wind, the same is true that the wicked are going to be punished in the same manner. They're going to be thrown back and forth into all types of different forms of suffering. And that's what it means. So similar to what we learned before, that when we referred to the righteous and we talked about that they're like a tree, there were two interpretations there. One was referring to how it's a metaphor of their lives in this world, and another interpretation was how it refers to their reward in the afterlife. Similar thing here. There's one way to look at this verse that's talking about their lives right here and right now, and how much they cause harm, and how even now, eventually in this world, there's going to be suffering in their end. But the other interpretation is it's talking about in the future, their future reward, which will be not a reward, but their future punishment, which will be obviously quite terrible. Okay. Now, the Malbim says here a very, very interesting idea. He says that the same way that this straw blows in the wind only after it separates from the grain, the same is true of the wicked. As long as they in some way are linked to the righteous and bring some benefit to righteous people. For example, what if, again, like they're in business, maybe they're giving some charity, or in some way there is some benefit to society that in some way benefits righteous people, they still are able to survive and they have something positive, some positive quality about them. However, chaff is the state of the straw once it's completely separated from the wheat. And in that state, that's the state where they're really doomed, because they have no connection to the righteous whatsoever. And at that point, they just have no merit. And so that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about the wicked in a state where they're bereft of any type of benefit to society. You could say that it's at a point where they are antagonists to the righteous people. And in that way, their very purpose in life cuts them off from the righteous. And instead of a benefit, just the opposite. They're trying to uproot, they're trying to interfere with what it is that the righteous people are trying to do. And that's the case, they've doomed themselves. Another way to potentially look at it is that the point in time where the chaff is separated from the wheat, what we're referring to is the way God operates in the world in his providence. Very often, as we mentioned before, we see that wicked people are successful in this world. And we may wonder why that's the case. Although in the end of the day, we really can't understand God's providence and why things occur. And in reality, we don't really know the depths of a human being. We don't know all their actions and all their thoughts. So it's impossible for us to judge. But in general terms, there's a general answer to this problem. And that is that God pays back the wicked in this world. So that any good deed that they do, he pays them back now here. So that in the next world, they'll be destroyed. That could be the meaning here of the chaff blowing in the wind after it separates from the wheat. In other words, after it separates from all good, that's when it's finally doomed. The Malbim goes on to say something else. He says that When can we enjoy the wheat? When it's separate from the chaff. This is teaching us that Hashem needs to separate the wicked and destroy them in order to reward the righteous. In Derech Hashem, the Ramchal explains that what God is one of God's objectives in this world is to bring about the perfect society in order that he can then have an intimate relationship and bestow upon that perfect society of the righteous his essence and reveal himself, and they can bask in this spiritual pleasure of knowledge of God. That environment can't exist with imperfection, he says. That environment can't exist where there is something that is against God within that environment. So in other words, the wicked have to be separated for the sake of the righteous in order that this perfect society can be created at the end of days. So before that time, the righteous have to be, the wicked must be separated out. That's also one of the references of the chaff blowing in the wind and being separated from the wheat or grain. Okay. Let's go on to the next verse. Al kain lo yakumu rishaim b'mishpat v'chatoim b'adas tzadikim. Therefore the wicked will not endure in judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. So a couple of issues here with this verse. First of all, what's the meaning of the therefore? What is the meaning of lo yakumu, which means, where in my English translation it says the wicked will not endure. But the truth is the word yakumu in the Hebrew, lo yakumu rishaim, that the wicked means the wicked will not stand. So what's the meaning of that? Lo yakumu rishon b'mishpat, they will not stand in judgment. V'chatoim b'adas tzadikim, and the sinners within the congregation or council of the righteous. So the next question is, why do we distinguish between the wicked, just as the wicked in judgment, and then it says the sinners in the congregation of the righteous? So there is a relationship between the judgment of the sinners being together with the righteous. That's not and yet when we refer to the sinners, when we refer to the wicked, we don't mention the righteous there at all. Let me go over that again. We start off the verse by saying, therefore, the wicked will not stand in judgment. We don't make any comparison to the righteous. We don't say that they will not stand in judgment with the righteous or like the righteous. We don't mention the righteous at all. And we say the sinners will not stand in judgment with the righteous. Why is that? Why is there that distinction? One category we don't mention the righteous as a comparison, and the other we do. So the words al kain, which means therefore, is a lot better understood according to the interpretation that we mentioned before, that the kamots, the comparison or metaphor of the wicked to chaff is referring to their actions in this world and the harm that they cause. Because then there's a better flow. We're saying that because of their actions, the harm that they've brought about, both physically and spiritually, that's why they're going to be judged then unable to endure that judgment, unable to prevail in that judgment. It's a little clearer. Nevertheless, if we think about the other interpretations that we said, we also are able to understand these words, therefore. Let's take it back a step. We said that, as the Malbim explains, that they're like chaff in the way that they're disconnected and distanced from the righteous. Also explains things. The judgment that will take place in favor of the righteous will not be able to aid them, because they've cut themselves off from that relationship. Now let's move on to the next question, the next point. It says here that the wicked will not stand in judgment. So there's two explanations of this word yakumu in terms of what its translation is. One means literally that they will not stand in judgment, meaning to say that they'll be destroyed before the judgment. That's one possible interpretation. The other is they won't survive the judgment, that after the judgment takes place, they won't survive. In other words, obviously, they also have to be calculated and have to be judged. But what we're referring to is the time of the resurrection at the end of days. And what we're saying is that these truly wicked people, as we said before, their good deeds will be exhausted in this world, and they'll have nothing left to be judged upon righteously for the next. And so they won't even have a chance to stand in that judgment. The other explanation is that they won't endure in the judgment. In reality, they're very, very close to each other and almost saying the same thing. Now, why the difference between the way that we refer to the wicked standing alone and the sinners in relation to the righteous? So the Malbim explains that the wicked, we're referring to those whose intentions are wicked and that their ideas are wicked. So they have malicious intent. They have a plan to behave wickedly. The sinners are people who behave in a wicked manner due to the different lusts and passions that they have that have been brought about by the evil inclination. So the Malbim says those people have an excuse. They can say, I was overcome. This wasn't who I really was. I was overcome by passion. I was overcome by anger, and I made a mistake. I didn't serve God because I was just too lazy. I couldn't overcome my lazy impulse, and so I didn't study Torah. That's why there's a juxtaposition of the sinners together with the righteous, because these sinners standing alone will not be judged as harshly until they're compared to the righteous. Standing alone, you may say, well, okay, he has an excuse. But once we examine the deeds of the righteous, then we say, wait a minute, they overcame their evil inclination. Why didn't you? Why didn't you do it? Why didn't you choose to? You could have. They prove, the righteous prove that a person can make the right choices, even if they're difficult. Okay. Okay. The next verse states, Ki yodei Hashem derech tzadikim v'derech reshaim tovei. So, for the Lord knows the ways of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So there's two basic explanations for this verse. What is it that Hashem knows about the way of the righteous that we're referring to? And what do we mean by that the ways of the wicked will be destroyed? Why is that? How is that an opposite of knowing the path of God? So generally speaking, when we're referring to the path of the righteous, or knowledge, I should say, of the path of the righteous, we're talking about providence. We're talking about the fact that Hashem pays kind of, so to speak, close attention to the ways of the righteous as opposed to the ways of the wicked. And in reality, this reflects a measure for measure. The righteous person, his mind is on God and is thinking about God, and in the same way, Hashem turns his eyes to him as well, and behaves in a manner of personalized providence, I would say, with that particular person. However, the wicked looks at the world that it's just probabilities, that there's no God, and similarly, measure for measure, God acts with him in the same vein in this world, that his life works based on probabilities, and if there's a certain situation that arises where based on chance he'll fail, or based on chance he will suffer, or suffer some type of dangerous fate, that will most likely happen to him. On the other hand, God watches carefully the ways of the righteous. Something we have to understand about this approach. Let's go back to the beginning a little bit. God is the creator of the world. He's creator of all the natural world that we see and that exists. He's also the creator of the moral reality of the world, its moral fabric. But as we examine all the beauty and the complexity of the world and the universe, and its seeming endlessness and its seeming endless amount of knowledge and complexity of its facts and of its phenomena, we wonder, or the religious person wonders, why? Why did God create all this? Why is there a world at all? Why is there being? That's seen as the starting point of the religious mind. The religious mind wants to know, why do I exist? To a certain extent, that's the question that early philosophers ask. The religious person asks himself the same question. Who made me? Why am I here? So, that's really two questions. A person looks at the world and sees all the beauty and complexity and says to himself, common sense tells me something, a vast intellect created all this. Someone made this happen. This doesn't happen on its own. It doesn't hiccup by itself. So that's the first conclusion that a common sense person comes to. After that, however, they had come to the next point. And that is, okay, there's this creator, this intelligent design, as they call it, right? There's a design, there's a designer of it all. Okay, but such an intellect would have a reason. what's the reason for the whole creation, all the complexity of it all. So much life, so much power and energy, so much passion, so many ideas. Everything is his creation. Why? Why did he do it all? Can a person truly on their own, through their own logic, come to a conclusion as to why and answer that question? It appears from Maimonides that the answer might be yes. Famously, Maimonides says in the Laws of Kings that a Ben Noach, who on his own comes to the conclusion of keeping the 7 Noahide commandments, that he's considered a wise one of the Gentiles, or of the sons of Noah. So evidently a person on his own can conclude that the purpose of the world is a certain moral purpose, certain moral objective. On the other hand, you can argue that it's not that there's an objective that the person has come to understand, but he's simply come to understand that in the same way that he sees around him a natural order of things, he says to himself, there must be a moral order as well. It doesn't make sense that God should create such an orderly world and leave the actions of man to chaos. This doesn't make any sense. And from that, he starts to look around and he examines anything that appears to be the good in the behavior of all the creatures in the world. And he attempts to imitate that. That's what our sages say, that he examines the actions of the cat, examines the action of the ant and various animals, and he sees their good behaviors and he adopts them. So in other words, what I'm saying is it could be even this very, very wise person doesn't know the purpose of life, but he does know that there's a moral order in life. And it's senseless to think that in such an organized world that a person's choices and morality is just chaos. So this is all intelligent conclusions. However, to know the purpose of creation, that needs revelation. For that, we have to have a revelation. We can't know. We can't know God's objectives without being told. There's really no way to discern it. And this actually is a logical argument for revelation itself. Because it's highly irrational that God should create a world, should create man on it, who has the understanding to comprehend how to behave, and would have the ability to comprehend on some level some type of purpose, but yet God fails to tell him what his purpose is. That doesn't make any sense. That's not a just God. That's not an intelligent God. That isn't a God that actually seeks to have his objective fulfilled. So he's also not a very skilled God at what he does as trying to bring about his objective, and that doesn't make any sense. So we have actually logical arguments for revelation. As we know, what is that revelation? That revelation is that the world is created in order that man should conduct himself in a manner commanded by God, in order that a human being through that can cleave and bond himself to God and really become as similar to God as he can. So there are two elements of being commanded. You've probably heard this before. One element is that when a king commands his servant, or a father gives a directive to his son, there's a certain deeper bond created between the two. And just like we have a concept in secular law of an agent standing in the shoes of his principal, similarly, if a person is commanded to do something that builds a special relationship where you're actually acting in the name of the one who commanded. So that builds a special relationship. That builds an intimacy. The second aspect is that behaving in the manner that is prescribed by God, we begin to imitate God's ways and how God interacts with his creation. And that way we become in some small way similar to him. And in that way we become closer. And that way he can bestow upon us the true good, which was his purpose from the beginning, which was to create another in order to bestow on that other true goodness, which is himself. Okay, now that we've set down this premise, we can understand a little bit this verse, that God knows the paths of the righteous and destroys the paths of the wicked. What does it mean to know? In terms of God. I mean, God knows everything. As Maimonides explains, he says that God's knowledge of all of creation is like God's own knowledge of his own self. It's like when someone, in Hebrew you say kaviyachol, it's not nice to say about God, but lahavdil, if someone has an itch or a pain, they know about it immediately. Similarly, everything that goes on in creation, it's God's knowledge of it isn't as something on the outside where he has to send the CIA to figure it out. He knows it himself. He knows it as if it's part of his own being. So, which is highly paradoxical, because at the same time, God is way above all of creation. In his infiniteness, he's beyond definition. And therefore you can't even really say he's distant from the world, because he's so different that distance doesn't even apply. And yet simultaneously he knows all its comings and goings and feels all its pains and knows of everyone's thoughts at the same time. So this God that is so infinite and so beyond pays close attention to the actions of the righteous. But as we explained, the reason for that is quite clear and obvious now. It's based on the introduction that I just gave. Because the righteous are the ones who are actually the objective. They're the ones, and everyone to his or her degree, everyone who is seeking out God and trying their best to fulfill the commandments is within the realm, within the category of tzaddikim, of the righteous. But the point is, those people is why God created the world. He created the world for them. Because that's the purpose. The purpose is that human beings should fulfill the commandments and seek to know God. I want to add to this that it's also known that traditionally the word yodea, to know, also means intimacy. As the verse famously says in Genesis, that Adam knew Eve, or Chava, his wife. So there's an element of that here as well, that God's relationship with the righteous is intimate. Intimately knows, pays attention. Even though he knows everything, but so to speak, he turns all his attention to this. But there's more than that. His relationship with the righteous is through a manifestation and an influence that reflects his very self. as opposed to the way God relates to the wicked. It's the Tanya explains that all the good that the wicked receive in this world, it's kind of like God throwing leftovers to a dog. In other words, but it's basically a similar idea. It's something that God doesn't want to do, something that he has to do, so to speak. I mean, he doesn't really have to do anything, but it's a part of his plan, but he doesn't really enjoy it. Just like someone has a huge feast and there's leftover food and he has to throw it out, or he has to give it to the cats outside, even though he spent $100 a plate. Not so happy about that situation. So similarly, God, so to speak, has to reward the wicked. Why does he have to do that? Well, because of choice. There isn't any way to create a scenario for there to be righteous in the world unless there'll be wicked who also will be able to attain success and pleasure and wealth. Without that, there's no choice. If the wicked would just disappear, then we'd all be robots and there wouldn't be any such thing as a righteous person. There wouldn't be any independence. And in that way, we would bear no resemblance to God in any real sense of the word. We'd be just like angels. In order to make ourselves similar to God, we have to take on the quality of independence. Just like God is free to make his own choices, we have to have freedom as well. We have the freedom to choose to follow his will or not, and we choose to follow, then we're imitating him. So that's the meaning that Hashem knows the path of the righteous. It could be that actually the reason why that the verse states that God knows the path of the righteous and not the righteous is also to include people who are maybe not 100% righteous, but they're following the path of the righteous. Hashem knows those people too. There's another point as to why the verse emphasizes that God knows the path of the righteous. And I think that is to minimize the physical aspect of things and to imply to us and teach us that God doesn't have intimacy with the body of the righteous person, but he has an intimacy with the acts of the righteous person. And those acts we know have, although they don't have any physical form or shape, but in the spiritual sense and in the spiritual spheres of existence, a person's actions do. Just like we find that it says in the chapters of the Fathers that every good deed creates a good angel, and every sin creates an angel of harm. So the verse seems to be telling us that God knows intimately those angels, and although the spiritual creations of the righteous, God is very intimate with. As it says by Noah, in reference to Noah, that Rashi tells us that the primary offspring of the righteous are their good deeds. In other words, all those holy angels that the righteous person creates and all the effects that they have, those are the true offspring of a righteous person. And the offspring, the physical offspring they have, is also, that offspring is primarily an offspring because of the righteous deeds and holiness that that new human being will bring into the world. On the other hand, it says, V'derech Rashaim Toveid, but the path of the wicked will be destroyed. Interestingly enough, I mean, in this part of the verse, we seem to be saying a mirror opposite of what we said in the first part of the verse. We're saying two things. First of all, we're saying that God doesn't really, quote, pay close attention because it's not really God's desire. The ways of the wicked are really of little interest to God. That's on one hand, because the language of knowledge isn't used. But on the other hand, we say, Derech Rishonim Toved. We say that the ways of the wicked will be destroyed. Obviously, destruction is a positive act. So despite everything that we've said till now, God will pay close attention to them to destroy their ways. Similar to what we said before, unfortunately, the wicked person over the course of their life has created themselves. Their derech has become who they actually are. You know, very often people say, that's not who I am, I'm a nice guy. But we are what we do in the end of the day. We are what we think at the end of the day. We are what we say at the end of the day. And it's all those paths that will have to stand in judgment at the end of a person's life, and at the end of days. And it is that God will not pay attention to. And being that God is a source of life in reality, and being that at the time of judgment, there'll be no need for a test. There'll be no need for choice at that time. In that case, there's absolutely no justification for the wicked to continue to exist, and they'll be destroyed. There is another approach to this, though, as well. As I mentioned, the verse implies that although God isn't paying attention to the wicked person in a positive sense, but there's certainly an affirmative act of destruction that's taking place. That act is being done in order to glorify God's name and in order to publicize the difference between the wicked and the righteous, in order that the whole world should know. And then, of course, the relationship or these dual realities taking place only further emphasizes the reward of the righteous person. Look at it this way. If God pays attention and sees that there are wicked people in the world that he has to destroy, possibly many of them, unfortunately, that he can't be intimate with. In that case, those people who are righteous, they're so much more precious. They're so much more important. They're no commodity. And they're God's whole purpose. They're God's whole desire. They're God's entire pleasure in everything that he made, in the entire universe, and in all the different universes, all the way up until the God's very self. So it's actually from the destruction of the wicked, kind of, you could say, from that disappointment grows even greater love between God and those who are loyal and faithful to him and fulfill the commandments. Now, the Malbim adds an interesting statement here. The Malbim says that Ki Yodea Hashem Derech Tzadikim, that God knows the path of the righteous. It's actually a mirror image. And what it means to say is that the righteous seek to know God. They're always thinking about him, and they are searching to know him. They're searching to follow his ways and through that to know him. So it's both intellectual and also active, physical. He says, through that, in a mirror image, God knows them. He doesn't say this, but it reminds me of the commonly known phenomenon where when you look at somebody, you stare at somebody, they turn around. They notice you're there. You look at somebody's back and they can feel that you're looking at them. So similarly, when a person's constantly thinking about God and trying to understand God's attributes in order to copy them and to follow in his ways and to see from the world around him, from events and from nature, and obviously, first and foremost, from Torah and Torah study, what is it that is Hashem's will, and what is all of the God's good attributes that we can learn from, then Hashem knows them too. They become, kind of the red dots on the screen. Kind of like God's got that big screen of the whole, map, like the NSA. They got this big map there, and there's all these little dots where all their agents are or something. So to speak, God has something like that. Every person who's paying attention, trying to seek him out and trying to follow in his ways, he picks that up more than his knowledge of all of the rest of creation. He finishes off by saying that the same way that a person is thinking about God and becomes bound with God, who is eternal, and his mind is always on the eternal, he becomes something eternal too, in a similar vein. Okay, I promised we were going to begin the next chapter, and I'm going to just begin the next chapter. Chapter 2, verse 1. Lama rogshu goyim u'umim yehegu rik. English, why do nations gather and peoples speak futility? Is yatzvu malchei eretz v'roznim nasdu yachad al Hashem ve'al Mashiach. The kings of the earth rise up, and rulers conspire together against the Lord and against his anointed. So what's the connection between this chapter, why do nations gather, and evidently they're rising up to do war against God and against his anointed one? What does that have to do with the previous chapter? So the Malbim says that that's the question. Why do nations gather? Is because they should have learned the previous verses. If they would have learned the previous verses and understood that the wicked survival is completely based on their clinging to the righteous person, they wouldn't rebel against the righteous. Now, I need to really back up and give a little background. And we're running out of time, so I guess I'll probably do that next time. But quickly and short, the chapter is talking about the nations that rise up against King David. And King David instituted various the Noahide laws for the Philistines. And they're rising up and rebelling against those laws and rebelling against David. So the point is, if they would have learned, they would have known that they're making a terrible mistake. We'll continue about that next time.
Okay, can you hear us now?
Yeah.
Excellent. Did everyone catch the whole idea there's a difference between one is wicked and the sinner? So you don't understand or do? Okay. Would you just take a moment to elaborate on the idea, the difference between a wicked person and a sinner? A wicked person sins, but a wicked person is different than a sinner. If you could explain.
Yes, I will. Okay. A wicked person is someone who has rebellious values. I guess you'd say it's more someone who's a heretic, meaning someone who doesn't have the basic fundamental values of goodness, of fear of God. It's also included in that category is somebody who maliciously is doing evil, premeditatively. That's the type of person the Malbim is calling wicked. So, in other words, the excuse of I did it because it was a moment of passion is absent. A sinner means someone who's doing sins. He's sinning, but that's not where his mindset is. You know, it's often the case. I mean, the truth is, it's true with every single one of us on one level or another. Is that we can have the right mindset. We really want to do what's right, but we have failings and we have weaknesses, and sometimes we don't do what we should be doing because we give in to those failings, or take it to another level. Maybe we don't work on those character traits in advance as we really should have, and because of that, we're overcome in a weak moment. So that's what a sinner is, and the wicked person is the one whose values are off. And because of that, they're actually premeditating sin. So it actually shows the severity of evil thoughts and evil plans. The Malbim understood that same thing, the same definition, at the beginning of chapter 1, when it says the Atzas Reshaim, referring to the counsel of the wicked. He said the wicked there, we're referring to them in terms of their counsel because they're thinking evil plans. They have evil values, and they're talking, their dialogue is in evil thoughts. That's the difference.
That's really good. I found some of your commentary at the end from the Malbim very encouraging. And the reason why I say that is, you know, we have this idea of the path of the righteous. You know, God knows the path of the righteous. I really appreciate how you explained it. But then I really began to think when God says to walk in my precepts, to walk in that way. David Melech also says that his feet would be pointed in the right direction, right? So you have these whole concepts, and you realize when you said it's not physical, it's not physicality, but it's spiritual. It's about what you do and what you focus on. That was very inspiring because there's a lot of people that are doing that look down on themselves like they don't do enough, or they're not like a tzaddik, and they don't realize that they're righteous because they do really want to be that way, and they try their best. So it's very inspiring. Anybody have a question? Speak loud. So.
Would you explain a little more about the angels of harm that are created? What are they active in the world? What do they do?
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to see any little naked people with wings or anything like that. I think that was probably some kind of a, some kind of a Greek image or something. I don't know where that came from. But although the prophets did see angels in various forms, that's not what they actually are. They're spiritual beings. They don't have any such form like a human form. There's two things about that. The main thing that we need to be aware of, which is, I promise you, it's guaranteed, I'd put money on it tomorrow, actually today. And that is, if a person sins, then they're going to be pulled down a path of more sins. They will have the opportunity to do more sins. They will have the inclination to do more sins, and so on and so forth, and it will continue down that road. There is nothing worse than a sin, not because of the sin itself, but because of on what path it leads you. That is the most terrifying part of it. God forbid a person fails in a certain test. Then they're put in, God forbid, in another type situation. And it really goes from the smallest things to the biggest things. If somebody, cancels a class or a learning session in Torah with somebody, guess what happens the next week? The other person, something's going on, it doesn't work out. You ever notice that? Why that happens like that? Because the energy, there's a certain energy that now is making it more difficult to create a space for holiness than it was before. Of course, we can turn that around, and that takes extra strength. And that the illumination from that teshuvah, from that return, and that extra determination is very great. But it's a dangerous situation. You don't want to put yourself in that situation. And that is really the true harm, because as we said before, real harm is the fact that a person becomes distant from God. And a person falls into a situation where, God forbid, the atheists become correct and everything is just throw at Monte Carlo, and everything is probabilities, and everything is just chance, and everything is just a projection, and there's no divine intervention in a person's life. God forbid. And that's the harm. The harm is that God, to a certain extent, is less providence in the person's life. And these forces kind of, like a certain magnetism, pull the person further upon that path. That couldn't be a worse thing than that. There's something I wanted to comment about your statement, Rod. I'm trying to think what it was, but it slipped my mind. Oh, yes. I wanted to say that, actually, that this depression that people have when they think about, oh, my actions just don't match up, that's one of the favorite tricks of the evil inclination, is to make a person feel depressed, make a person feel like their actions are just really not worth much. What's the difference anyway? Look where I am. What am I doing? And that's actually also one of the harmful angels that are created. Person, immediately after they do something wrong, they feel like, you know what, I'm not going to pray tonight. I'm not going to study, because how could I, after I just did, approach doing those type of things? And of course, that's the worst mistake that a person can do.
I also wanted to add, as Sandy had mentioned about the negative angels, conversely, there's room that exists that when we do mitzvot, it's easier to do more mitzvot because we're creating positive spiritual forces around us, correct?
100%, of course. And we know that the power of holiness is always much, much greater than the power of impurity. So if a person does something positive, the divine providence leading them towards more mitzvot is going to be so much greater. And obviously, again, measure for measure, if a person pushes beyond, and if a person, is a risk taker and, pushes beyond their comfort zone to do Hashem's will, despite that, everyone else is doing differently, and it's embarrassing, or it's not the way they were brought up, or whatever it may be, that really opens up a tremendous, tremendous fountain of spiritual energy and blessing towards that person. A person has to keep that in mind really, really strongly. And the way to approach obstacles and a lack of desire to do Torah and its commandments, everyone according to their obligations, is to realize that it's all for the good. That from the difficulty, really from that is going to come, the person will reach a higher heights. So even if at the moment the person feels, oh, I really don't want to do this, for whatever reason it is, if the person pushes beyond that and realizes, wait a minute, this is a test. It really isn't as difficult as it seems. However, if I overcome this kind of seductive thought that says, I can't, it's too late, it's too hard, my boss isn't going to like it, whatever it may be, my family are going to, who knows what's going to happen, my job, and whatever it is, the fear, okay, or the feeling that the person has that is pushing them away from that commandment, and they overcome that, then the illumination will be so much greater. So it's really an opportunity. It has to be viewed as an opportunity. And also a person has to realize that whatever obstacle, it's really an illusion. And if a person realizes that it's just an illusion, it's just a kind of the old reason is that it should be a test, and it's really not what it appears, and they put their faith in God, they'll see they'll be successful.